It was pouring rain the night my wife of 7 years, Sarah, locked me out of our house. I stood on the wet pavement, my clothes completely soaked, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as I stared at the 3 black trash bags sitting on the curb. Those bags held my entire life. Through the massive bay window of the living room, a room I had spent 5 years paying the mortgage on, I could see her laughing. She was pouring an expensive glass of red wine for a man wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. That man was Richard Sterling, the billionaire CEO of the luxury real estate firm she worked for. My parents were in that living room too, sitting on my couch, clinking glasses with Richard, celebrating the fact that their underachieving son had finally been replaced by a real man. Sarah walked to the window, looked me dead in the eye through the rain-streaked glass, smirked, and pulled the blinds shut. It was the most isolating, humiliating moment of my entire existence. But as the freezing rain soaked through my cheap jacket, I didn't feel broken. I felt a slow, terrifyingly calm sense of anticipation, because what none of them knew, not my cheating wife, not the arrogant CEO, and certainly not my toxic family, was that I had just spent the last 3 years quietly building an artificial intelligence firm that was about to go public. And in exactly 6 months, I was going to systematically dismantle their entire world. To understand how I ended up on the street while my parents toasted my replacement, you have to understand the sickening, twisted dynamic I was raised in. In my family, I was the invisible workhorse, and my younger brother, Tyler, was the golden child. The dynamic was established early and enforced with brutal consistency. If Tyler wanted to go to an expensive out-of-state summer camp, my parents paid for it without a second thought, leaving me at home to cook my own dinners and mow the lawn. When Tyler wrecked his first car, a brand new sports sedan my parents bought him for his 16th birthday, they hugged him, told him the car's brakes must have been defective, and immediately bought him a luxury SUV. When I needed a reliable laptop for college, my father sat me down and told me that building character meant working double shifts at a diner to buy it myself. Tyler was charismatic, loud, and handsome in a very conventional, polished way. He was also profoundly lazy, completely, entirely incapable of holding down a job, and deeply manipulative. I was quiet, analytical, and perfectly content to sit behind a screen for 14 hours a day studying software architecture and logistics. My parents firmly believed Tyler was destined for greatness, destined to be a high-profile executive or a famous public figure. They believed I was destined to be his safety net. That toxic dynamic carried over into our adult lives, poisoning everything it touched. Tyler managed to smooth talk his way into a series of flashy but ultimately hollow sales jobs, spending his days taking clients to lavish lunches, taking credit for his colleagues' ideas, and racking up staggering amounts of credit card debt to maintain the illusion of a wealthy lifestyle. I, on the other hand, went a completely different route. I became a back-end software developer, specializing in highly technical, incredibly niche predictive logistics. Because I worked remotely from a small home office, wore sweatpants most days, and never bragged about my income, my parents and Tyler assumed I was a low-level IT drone barely scraping by on minimum wage. They refused to understand my career, actively mocking me at family gatherings for playing on the computer all day, and eventually I stopped trying to explain myself. When I met Sarah, she was a breath of fresh air. She was an entry-level administrative assistant, sweet, grounded, and seemingly just as determined to build a quiet, stable life as I was. We bonded over our shared ambition, our late-night diner dates, and our dreams of financial security. For the first 5 years of our marriage, we were genuinely happy. We bought a modest house in the suburbs, and I supported her completely as she decided to go back to school to get her real estate license. I paid for her classes, I cooked her meals when she was studying, and I cheered the loudest when she finally passed her exams. But as soon as she landed a junior agent position at Sterling Luxury Properties, everything began to shift. The sweet girl I married was rapidly replaced by a woman obsessed with status, designer labels, and corporate networking. She began complaining about my lack of ambition. She rolled her eyes when I told her I was working on a massive independent coding project, telling me that typing on a keyboard wasn't a real career. She started spending more time with her colleagues and more specifically with her boss, Richard Sterling. The real breaking point began about a month before I was kicked out. My parents had called an emergency family dinner at their house. Whenever they used that phrase, it meant someone needed money, and that someone was always Tyler. Sarah and I sat at my parents' dining room table, the air thick with tension. Tyler was sitting across from me, looking uncharacteristically nervous, aggressively tapping his foot against the hardwood floor. My father didn't even bother offering me a drink before dropping the bomb. He cleared his throat, using his authoritative dad voice, and announced that Tyler was in a bit of a tight spot and they needed me to step up. When I asked what kind of tight spot, Tyler let out a dramatic sigh. He claimed it wasn't his fault, that the culture in his industry was cutthroat, and that you had to spend money to make money. He had leased a luxury car he couldn't afford, taken out massive personal loans to buy designer watches to impress clients, and now the creditors were freezing his accounts. He was $120,000 in high-interest debt, and if he declared bankruptcy, he would lose his job. My father leaned forward, his eyes hard and uncompromising. He told me that they had looked into my finances. Because Sarah and I had lived so frugally, and because I had quietly paid off our mortgage, my parents demanded that I take out a home equity loan on my house to pay off Tyler's debts. The room went dead silent. I actually laughed, thinking it was a sick joke, but the icy glares from my parents and my wife confirmed it was not. I looked at Sarah, fully expecting her to defend our home, the house we had built together. Instead, she was looking down at her perfectly manicured nails, completely detached. When she noticed the silence, she looked up, sighed, and told me to just do it. She said it was family, and that since I was just sitting around the house all day not contributing to the real world, the least I could do was help my brother, who actually had potential. The betrayal in her words felt like a physical blow to the chest. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking with rage, and told them I wouldn't give Tyler a single dime. I told them I worked 80-hour weeks to build my life, and that Tyler needed to deal with the consequences of his own staggering financial incompetence. My mother burst into theatrical tears, calling me a cruel, jealous sociopath. My father turned purple, screaming that if I walked out that door, I was no longer a part of the family. He told me I was a failure holding Sarah back and that I would die alone. I walked out anyway. The drive home with Sarah was suffocatingly silent. When we got to the house, the argument exploded. She accused me of being jealous of Tyler and resentful of her success. During the fight, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up. It was a message from Richard Sterling. I couldn't help but look. The message read, "Don't let the dead weight ruin your weekend. I'll make sure you're taken care of on the yacht tomorrow. Miss you." My heart plummeted into my stomach. I pointed at the phone, demanding to know why her billionaire boss was telling her he missed her and inviting her onto a yacht. She snatched the phone away, her face flushing crimson, but she didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed. She told me it was just how people in her industry talked, that I needed to grow up, and that Richard actually believed in her, unlike me. That night, I slept in the guest room. Over the next month, our marriage completely disintegrated. Sarah started coming home at 2 a.m, smelling like expensive scotch and men's cologne. She completely stopped hiding her text messages. My parents stopped calling me, but I saw through social media that they were frequently having dinner with Sarah and Tyler, completely freezing me out of my own family. During that entire month of agonizing emotional torture, I poured every ounce of my energy into my software project. For 3 years, I had been building a revolutionary AI-driven supply chain and property management algorithm. It was designed to predict market fluctuations, automate massive commercial property acquisitions, and streamline corporate logistics with zero human error. It was a multi-billion-dollar concept, and I had built the entire architecture from the ground up. I had been secretly negotiating with Apex Holdings, the largest multinational tech conglomerate in the world, to sell the proprietary rights to my software. Because of the sheer scale of the deal, I was bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement. I couldn't tell anyone about the massive fortune I was about to acquire, not even my wife. Then came the night of our 7th wedding anniversary. I had foolishly hoped that the milestone might snap Sarah back to reality. I bought her a beautiful necklace, ordered food from our favorite restaurant, and waited for her to come home from work. She finally walked through the front door at 9 o'clock at night, but she wasn't alone. Richard Sterling walked in behind her, wearing a bespoke suit, looking around my modest suburban home with a look of utter disgust. And behind Richard were my parents and my brother Tyler. I stood in the living room, holding the small velvet box with the necklace, completely paralyzed by confusion. Sarah didn't even look at me. She walked straight into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and leaned against the counter. Richard stepped forward. A cruel, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He looked me up and down, sneered, and told me that my services were no longer required. He said that Sarah was a brilliant, driven woman unburdened by mediocrity, and that it was time she cut the dead weight loose to truly soar. I looked at Sarah, begging for an explanation. She took a sip of her wine and coldly informed me that she was filing for divorce. She said she was moving into a luxury penthouse Richard had bought for her downtown. But that wasn't the worst part. Because my name was on the deed to the house, but we had purchased it after we were married, she demanded I vacate the premises immediately. She had her lawyers draft an aggressive preliminary injunction, claiming she felt unsafe around me to force me out of the property until the divorce was finalized. My mother stepped out from behind Richard, her eyes flashing with vindictive triumph. She looked at me and said, "You brought this on yourself, David. You refused to help your own flesh and blood. Now Sarah is going to let Tyler live here until the house is sold. At least someone in this family knows how to treat people with respect." Tyler smirked, leaning against my front door, already looking like he owned the place. I tried to argue. I tried to scream. But Richard simply snapped his fingers, and two massive private security guards stepped into the house from the porch. They grabbed me by the arms, dragged me into the bedroom, and gave me exactly 5 minutes to pack whatever I could fit into 3 trash bags. They didn't let me take my computer monitors, my office furniture, or any of my personal mementos. They marched me out the front door and tossed the bags onto the wet pavement as the rain began to fall. That brings us back to the moment on the curb, standing in the freezing rain, watching my family celebrate with the man who was sleeping with my wife. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I pulled my waterproof hard drive, the one containing the master code to my life's work, out of my soaked pocket, gripped it tightly, and walked 3 miles in the rain to a cheap motel off the highway. For the next 6 months, I lived like a ghost. I stayed in that dingy motel room, eating instant ramen and working 20 hours a day on a cheap laptop to finalize the Apex Holdings deal. Sarah's high-priced lawyers aggressively pursued the divorce, trying to bleed me dry for every penny of my modest bank account, and forcing the sale of our home, ensuring Tyler lived there rent-free in the interim. I didn't fight them. I signed every paper they sent me without a word of protest. I gave her the house. I gave her the car. I let them think they had completely destroyed me. Because while they were celebrating my demise, the ink was drying on the most lucrative tech acquisition of the decade. Apex Holdings didn't just buy my software. They bought me. The board of directors realized that my algorithm was so advanced that they needed me to oversee its implementation across their entire global portfolio. They finalized a buyout for $350 million, transferring an astronomical sum into a newly formed offshore LLC in my name. They also appointed me as the chief operating officer of their newly established global real estate division, giving me absolute unchecked authority over their commercial acquisitions. I went from sleeping in a damp motel bed to commanding a corporate empire overnight. I spent a few weeks getting my life in order. I bought a sprawling, private estate overlooking the ocean, hired a team of elite wealth managers, and completely upgraded my wardrobe. But I didn't forget the people who put me in that motel. I hired a private intelligence firm to conduct a deep, forensic audit into Richard Sterling, his company, and my family. What they found was staggering. Richard's luxury real estate firm, Sterling Properties, was a massive house of cards. He had over-leveraged his assets, taken out massive loans to fund his billionaire lifestyle, and his company was teetering on the edge of complete bankruptcy. He desperately needed a major corporate bailout to survive, and he was currently aggressively courting Apex Holdings to acquire his failing firm. As for Tyler, Richard had hired him as a senior sales director at Sterling Properties as a favor to Sarah and my parents. Tyler was making an exorbitant salary, continuing his lavish lifestyle, and my parents were bragging to anyone who would listen about their incredibly successful son and his brilliant new corporate connections. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had won. It was time to show them how wrong they were. Apex Holdings arranged a massive, highly publicized corporate gala at the most exclusive high-rise venue in the city to announce their new real estate division and to finalize their upcoming corporate acquisitions. Richard Sterling was invited. He was under the impression that the mysterious new COO of Apex was going to sign the paperwork to bail out his failing company that very night. I arrived at the gala in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than my parents' entire retirement fund. The ballroom was a marvel of glass, steel, and extravagant wealth. There were hundreds of industry elites mingling, drinking champagne, and waiting for the keynote presentation. I bypassed the main floor and stood in the shadowed VIP mezzanine overlooking the crowd. It didn't take long to spot them. Richard was holding court near the center of the room, sweating profusely despite his arrogant posture, desperately trying to network with the Apex board members. Sarah was clinging to his arm, wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost a year's salary, looking incredibly smug as she looked down on the other attendees. And right behind them were my parents and Tyler. Tyler was aggressively handing out business cards, while my mother and father beamed with pride, practically vibrating with the desire to be noticed by the billionaires in the room. The CEO of Apex Holdings, a ruthless older man named Marcus, stepped up to the podium on the main stage. The room fell into a hushed silence. Marcus tapped the microphone, welcoming the crowd, and began to speak about the future of the company. Tonight, we are not just announcing a new division. Marcus's voice boomed over the sound system. We are announcing a complete revolution in commercial real estate and corporate logistics. We have acquired a proprietary technology that will render traditional property management entirely obsolete. But more importantly, I'm here to introduce the architect of this revolution. The man who built this technology from the ground up, our new majority shareholder, and the absolute final authority on all Apex acquisitions moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our new Chief Operating Officer, Mr. David Evans. The spotlight swung away from the stage and hit the staircase leading down from the VIP mezzanine. I stepped into the light and began my slow descent toward the main floor. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and violently chaotic. I kept my eyes locked on Richard's group. The arrogant smirk on Richard's face melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His jaw actually unhinged. Sarah stumbled backward in her high heels, her hand flying to her mouth as if she were trying to wake up from a nightmare. She looked at my tailored suit, the team of security flanking me, and the sheer power radiating from my position. My mother literally dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. Tyler's face drained of all color, his arrogant posture collapsing as he realized the basement IT drone was now the most powerful man in the building. I walked onto the stage, shook Marcus's hand, and stepped up to the podium. I looked out over the sea of faces, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. I stared directly into Sarah's terrified eyes. In the corporate world, I began, my voice calm, cold, and projecting perfectly. We have a term for assets that produce no value. We call them dead weight. And sometimes you have to cut the dead weight loose to truly soar. I saw Sarah physically flinch as I repeated the exact words Richard had used the night they threw me out. Mr. Sterling, I said, addressing Richard directly. The entire room turned to look at him. He looked like he was going to vomit. I have spent the last week reviewing the acquisition proposal for Sterling Luxury Properties. I have audited your financials, your leadership, and your personnel. Richard swallowed hard, his hands visibly trembling. David, Mr. Evans, please. The synergies between our firms. There are no synergies, I cut him off, my voice echoing like a judge's gavel. Your company is functionally bankrupt. You have over-leveraged your assets to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. Your management is incompetent, your practices are outdated, and your firm is entirely devoid of value. Apex Holdings is officially rejecting your buyout proposal. Furthermore, because you owe our subsidiary banks over $80 million in defaulted commercial loans, I have authorized our legal team to begin immediate asset seizure. By tomorrow morning, Sterling Properties will cease to exist, and your personal assets will be liquidated to cover the debt. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispers. Richard collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands, completely and utterly destroyed. His empire was gone in less than 60 seconds. I turned my attention to Tyler, who was desperately trying to hide behind my father. And as for the staff of Sterling Properties, I continued, zeroing in on my brother, I noticed you recently hired a new senior sales director, a man with a staggering history of financial incompetence and zero qualifications, hired entirely as a favor. Tyler, considering the company you work for is now defunct, I suggest you start updating your resume. Though I doubt any firm in this city will hire a man whose entire career is built on nepotism and fraud. Tyler started hyperventilating. My father stepped forward, his face red with a mixture of terror and desperation. David, son, you can't do this. He's your brother. We're your family. I leaned into the microphone. I don't have a family, I stated with absolute finality. I have a group of parasites who tried to bleed me dry to fund a failure, and when I refused, they threw me onto the street in the rain. Do not ever refer to me as your son again. Security, please escort these 4 individuals off the premises. They are trespassing at a private corporate event. The poetic justice was intoxicating. 4 massive security guards descended upon them. Richard was too stunned to fight. He was hauled away like a lifeless rag doll. Tyler began crying openly, pleading with the guards, embarrassing himself in front of the most powerful people in the city. My parents were screaming my name, begging for forgiveness, their voices growing fainter as they were forcibly dragged toward the service elevator. Sarah didn't scream. She broke away from the guards, ran to the edge of the stage, and looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. David, please, she sobbed, her voice trembling with desperation. I didn't know. Richard manipulated me. I was confused. You know I love you. We can fix this. I never wanted the divorce. We can go back to our house. I looked down at the woman I had loved for 7 years. I looked at the diamond necklace her bankrupt billionaire had bought her. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just pity. You made your choice, Sarah, I said quietly, stepping back from the edge of the stage. Enjoy the penthouse, assuming the bank doesn't foreclose on it tomorrow. I turned my back on her as the guards grabbed her arms and dragged her out of the ballroom. The heavy double doors shut firmly behind them, completely erasing them from my life. The rest of the evening was a blur of vindication. The executives who would have ignored me a year ago were practically tripping over themselves to shake my hand. I finalized the new corporate restructuring, celebrated with my new board, and left the gala feeling a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders. The fallout over the next 6 months was absolute carnage. The financial news networks had a field day with the collapse of Sterling Properties. Richard Sterling was investigated for corporate fraud, lost every penny to his name, and is currently facing federal indictment. Because he lost everything, he immediately dumped Sarah, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Tyler was forced to declare bankruptcy. Without his high-paying fake job, his creditors seized everything. My parents, desperate to save their golden child, took out a second mortgage on their own home to pay off his remaining debts, functionally destroying their own retirement. Then came a cold, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting in the massive, quiet library of my new oceanfront estate, reading a book by the fireplace, when the intercom system buzzed. My security detail at the front gate informed me there was a woman demanding to see me. I pulled up the security feed on my tablet. Standing outside the heavy iron gates, shivering in the freezing rain, was Sarah. She looked entirely defeated. Her designer clothes were replaced by a cheap raincoat. She looked exhausted, older, and utterly broken. I pressed the button on the intercom to speak to her. David? Her voice crackled through the speaker, thick with tears. David, please. I know you're in there. I have nowhere else to go. I can't pay my rent. Richard is gone. Your parents won't even talk to me because they blame me for everything. Please, I just need a place to stay. I'm so sorry. I was so stupid. Please, just open the gate. I sat in my leather chair, listening to the rain hit the massive windows of my library. I thought about the night I stood in the rain, staring at my life stuffed into 3 trash bags, while she laughed and poured wine for another man. I leaned toward the microphone. It's raining out there, Sarah, I said, my voice perfectly calm. You should probably find an umbrella. Don't ever come here again. I released the button, shutting off the intercom system permanently. I watched on the screen as she collapsed against the iron gates, sobbing into her hands as the rain continued to pour. After a few minutes, she slowly stood up, turned around, and walked away into the dark. I closed the security feed, set my tablet down, and picked my book back up. The fire cracked warmly in the hearth. I had spent my entire life being pushed into the shadows, treated like a contingency plan for people who didn't appreciate my mind or my loyalty. But the thing about keeping someone in the dark for so long is that when they finally step into the light, they know exactly how to build an empire, and I have never felt more at peace.